Thank you, Peter. And before I go any further, I just want to thank Peter Ordway and Hort Spitzer there in the back, and Dick Carson, and Nancy Clancy, and E. Lewis, who really put this whole thing together. I know, frankly, that most of you came because you had the chance to have free hamburgers and hot dogs. But nevertheless, I'm actually proud to live in a community where people would come out to have a public discussion like this, and it just goes with our whole temperament here in Jackson Hole. It's a great place to live, obviously, because of the physical beauty, but most importantly, because it's a great community. So I'm just deeply appreciative to everybody for coming out tonight. Thirdly, I'm grateful for one other thing. This is the first, if you will, in a series. On June, this is the most important person in the audience here, right here, because it's about this young person. On June 26th, in about a month, our former senior senator, Alan Simpson, is going to be in town, and is going to talk about the commission that he co-chaired with Erskine Bowles over at the Center for the Arts. And there's going to be an event. I believe that's also free, although I can't promise free hot dogs and hamburgers, but they probably wouldn't let you bring them into the auditorium anyway. But it's Sunday night, June 26th, 7 o'clock. I know I'll be there. I would encourage all of you to go. I'll just say I'm glad I'm going first, because I know that Senator Simpson will be terrific, and I know he'll be a lot funnier than I will be. Now, what we were asked to do tonight is talk a little bit about the deficit, debts, the U.S. economy. And anytime you're going to take a tour of the U.S. economy, it's kind of a good news, bad news story. It reminds me of a story that about the time that God decided the world was going to end in 2 days. So he did what seems a little bit rational. He called up President Obama and President Medvedev of the Soviet Union, of now Russia, and President Cristina Fernandez Kirchner of Argentina. He called them to heaven. He said, world's going to end in 2 days, go back and prepare your people. So President Obama did a lot of things. He called a joint session of Congress. This was last year, Nancy was still the speaker. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans on national TV, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is there is a God. Madam, it's a kind and generous soul. Bad news is the world's going to end in 2 days. Go home and prepare your people. President Medvedev, being a friend of Putin's, had no trouble getting Russian TV time. And being a Russian, he said, my fellow Russians, I have some horrible news and some terrible news. The horrible news is there is a God. The disastrous news is what's going to end in 2 days. Now, President Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, being an Argentine, she said, fellow Argentines, I have some wonderful news and I have some fantastic news. The wonderful news is there is a God. Madam is an Argentine football fan. Those are her fans. His hand has helped Maradona in the past. The fantastic news is our currency crisis will be over in 2 days. I start with a story about Argentina because Argentina is an example for what we're going to talk about tonight. There are history buffs in the audience. If you look a century ago, at the turn of the century going into the 20th century, Argentina was one of the healthiest, richest, and fastest growing economies in the world. Certainly in the top 10 of both GDP and GDP per capita, led by exports, investments in railroads, utilities, etc. Early in that century, they elected a president, Mr. Irigoyen, who established mandatory pensions, mandatory health care for all workers, and a whole series of payroll taxes to pay for that system. Stayed in place in various forms of government. Famously, right after the Second World War, Juan Perón, the husband of Evita, if you've all been to Broadway and seen the play Evita, took over. And what he did is he went even further with the government's involvement in the economy. He nationalized the electric utility sector, the railroad sector, the merchant marine, transportation sector, even their export of grains and oilseeds. By the time you got to the mid-'80s, the country was in so much debt to finance these public entities and the public entities themselves issuing debt, that they were just printing money at a rapid pace. By 1990, in the year 1990, the inflation rate in Argentina was 1,300% for 1 year. By 1993, that payroll tax, which started at 1%, then was at 5%, was 26% of people's wages. And to that, over the prior decades, had been added an income tax, a VAT tax, a tax on wealth, not how much you make, but how much you have. And of course, GDP per capita and gross GDP had fallen from the top 5 in the world to around 40. Then, this is how they compared to the growth of the other top 20 countries in the world. You can see that first bit, 1900 to 13, they outstripped the rest of the world. Those are other OECD countries. And literally, for the next 90 years, they fell behind and fell behind and fell behind. Until about a decade ago, there was a crisis. Investment capital continued to leave the country because of gigantic deficits and debt. They tried to cut wages and the pensions benefits they'd given out, but they were too great. And at the end of 2001, they basically, quote unquote, restructured. They defaulted on $132 billion of debt. Capital was leaving so fast that as soon as they, first of all, second, there was no growth. Second of all, as soon as they defaulted, the peso lost 70% of its value in 4 months. There were riots in the street, 20 people died in the riots. Real GDP in the first 4 months of 2002 fell by 11%. Just to kind of give you a sense of the magnitude of that, in our crash here in 2009, for the whole year, nominal GDP fell by less than 2%. Fell by 1.75% for the year. Inflation went from basically nothing to 41% in 1 year. And the economy has since recovered. The economic minister at the time, Domingo Cavallo, was out on the speaking circuit. I was very, very interested to say, what could have happened? He said, if only we had acted earlier. So that brings us to our topic for tonight. We are running an experiment that has never been run before in the United States. I just want to talk about the nature and magnitude of that experiment. Second thing is, there's a big debate. There's a national debate. It's going on in our Congress and among the President and the White House and the Congress. It's going on in every state, to be honest, because the problem in the states is not different from the federal problem. And it's what do you do? And they're really kind of two big dials you can turn, spending and taxes. And thirdly, it's not only how much you spend, it's what you spend it on. And I want to talk about that, because that is the answer to another question that people ask, well, can't we grow our way out? Isn't there a way to grow our way out? So let's talk about those three topics. First, here's the experiment we're running. I think most people know this. The debt limit right now in the United States is $14.3 trillion. We're just about at it. And just for perspective, our gross output last year as a country was about $14.6 trillion. So right at about 100% of debt to GDP. What's perhaps a little more troubling is the rate at which we are accumulating debt. This chart just shows for the last several administrations the annual deficit as a percent of GDP, which has bounced along between 2, 3, and 4. President Reagan and the first President Bush got up around 4. They got a lot of grief. But the average, you can see about 2.5% over the last multiple administrations. For the last 3 years, it's been about 10% of GDP. About $1.5 trillion a year for now 3 fiscal years in a row on that 14.7 trillion of GDP. And by the way, as the Greek crisis was unfolding a year ago, people were saying, gee, once you get deficit to GDP at about that 10% rate, that's what's really dangerous. People begin to lose confidence in you. Well, the annual deficit as a percent of GDP in Greece is only 11%. So we are comparable at the moment to Greece. Peter said, make it simple, so here's simple. What is driving that? And I would argue the biggest piece is spending. This is just right out of the OMB sort of annual historical tables and the U.S. Department of Commerce summary of our GDP. Federal outlays have gone from 1.7 trillion, this is in nominal, terms, to $3.5 trillion in the exact same time period. So they've doubled in the exact same time period that the overall economy grew by 50%. So first question is, does anybody in the room think that's sustainable? Of course not. If you're going to spend at that rate, and your economy is going to grow at that rate, by definition, spending as a percent of GDP is going to grow and grow radically. What's driving the spending? Well, what is our budget made up of? Here's the simple math on the budget. This government this year will spend about $3.5 trillion. I said we have $1.5 trillion deficit. Here's the bad news. We only take in $2 trillion. We only take in $2 trillion. Now look at this chart. If you just take entitlements and interest, that's more than $2 trillion. That's 60% of our budget. Two things about entitlements and interest. First of all, what do most people think about when they think about the government and what should the federal government be doing? They say, well, they should defend the country. They should run the Army and the Air Force and the Marines and the Navy. They should perhaps build highways because no company could do that by itself. They should fund basic research for which no company could capture the rents. They should, a lot of people believe, they should be spending money on education, although that's primarily a state and local function, as we all know. None of those things are included in that first $2 trillion. None, zero.